Hi Gordon, can you please introduce yourself and tell us how long have you been working as a system operator?
Sure. My name is Gordon Kane. I've worked in the power industry for 48 years. I'm soon to be retired, but I worked in the control room, started in the control room in 1992, and I worked through till 2016. I held the position of the senior power system controller from 2005.
Thank you. Please explain the power system we are going to discuss today. Tell us about the geography of the system and peak, minimum, and average demand, or anything that is more relevant.
Sure. So we're talking back in the early 90s. So in those days, the generation profile was more based around coal. So we had coal-fired power stations at Muja, Bunbury, South Fremantle and East Perth, and the main coal field was down in the Collie area down in the southwest. So most of the other power stations got train coal deliveries, and but yeah, it's fair to say that the backbone was all coal. In the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, they started putting in a few gas turbines. But on top of that, they were also putting a lot of 330 kV infrastructure in. And once the 330 came in, they actually went back to coal and started putting more coal-fired stations in the southwest. So yeah, the backbone was always coal. I mean, we were talking probably 80% coal and 20% gas turbines.
Yes, in this discussion we are talking about Southwest Interconnected System, which is the main grid in Western Australia. Can you explain about geography of this grid? How big is it?
Yeah, so the grid stretches from Albany in the southwest to Geraldton, so that's about 1,000 kilometres, and then it goes inland to Kalgoorlie, which is about 600 kilometres from the metro area going east. That's a sort of skinny radial that goes east through a 220 kV interconnector. But so the main generation profile and load centres are all up the west coast. And as I said, the coal fields are in the southwest. So what it meant was the bulk of the base load generation was in the southwest, coming up through the 330 lines into the metro area where the main load centre is.
Yeah, 1,000 kilometers from north to south and 600 kilometers from east to west.
East to west, yeah.
This is a really big footprint.
Yeah. I mean, it's what you're used to. I've never had anything else done. So, but it's when we look at comparable systems in places like Ireland or other places that have been mentioned, yeah, it's pretty big. It's pretty big.
Yeah, we are keen to talk to you about the blackout that happened in 1994.
Right.
And you were the controller on shift, and I would like to talk to you about anything that is really an insight that can be used for the future. For example, tell us about the conditions on the day, including weather conditions. Was this a predictable event? Were you expecting it, or how did it happen?
Yeah, I was a junior on the day, so I was actually a trainee on the day. The way the control room was set up at that time, we had a generation controller, we had a bulk transmission controller, and then we had two regional transmission controllers. So the bulk transmission controller looked after the 330 kV lines and the main 132 kV lines that brought the energy north, and then the regional transmission guys looked after the distribution through the 13266 networks into the distribution substations. So I was training on the bulk transmission desk that day. So we'd had a period of hot days, probably up in the 35, 37, 38 degree days. And on a couple of nights previous to this, we'd been experiencing very humid conditions. So because we're on the coast for a lot of the stuff, and there was pollution on a lot of the different substations and transmission lines, we were experiencing some line trips because of arcing, and we'd had a couple of flashovers. So that was the sort of background over the previous 2 nights. On this night, it was very humid. We had a fairly big load. Our normal overnight loads would have been, without the hot weather, something around 1,200 megawatts. When I came in on shift at 7:30, we had about 1,700 megawatts on the system. So it was you could tell it was going to be another bumper day. And when I came in, they'd lost a few transmission lines over the night, 66 kV lines, 132 lines, and a couple of 330 kV lines. But when we came in, they had reduced the voltage on the system, and all lines were back in service. So, we were just setting ourselves up. It was humid. You keep the volts down till the sun comes up. The sun usually blows the humidity away, and then you get back into, building the system for the upcoming load. So, 7 o'clock, 7:07 actually on the day. I can't actually remember the date, but I remember it was 7:07 because in the control room we had a clock, a frequency meter, and a load meter that were opposite us on the opposite wall. And 7:07, all of a sudden we had a bank of fluorescent lights above us, and the fluorescent lights started to dim. And there's not a lot that will dim fluorescent lights except low volts. So we saw something was happening, and as we were watching this, the computer monitors we had were the big old, CRT monitors that had big fans in them. They were used to, a couple of kilowatts each, sort of thing. And you could even hear the fans winding down inside the monitors. So we could see that something was happening, and on the opposite wall, the updating load started coming down and down. 1,700 megawatts, 1,300 megawatts, 1,100 megawatts. It finally stabilized at 108 megawatts. So what's that? We lost 1,600 megawatts approximately in probably about 30 seconds. So we all sort of looked at each other, and we knew what had happened. Yeah.
So I can't imagine that this has been really a very stressful sort of event. Can you tell us about what sort of immediate actions were taken and the important things to know in the first few minutes?
Yeah, I've got to say, we'd come through a period of time in the early 90s where we were short of generation a fair bit, and if we had outages, we would have under-frequency load shedding. So when you say it was stressful, it was the enormity of it that sort of really hit us first, not the stress, because we had sort of not prepared for this, but we knew what was happening. So the first thing you think of is why did it happen? What was the catalyst for this? So and then from that you can start formulating a response. Have we had an explosion somewhere? Have we had, is there things that need to be looked at from a safety perspective? And then you sit down and say, okay, how are we going to tackle that? So the main bulk transmission controller, he was the one that took the lead. Luckily we had a group within Western Power, the field service officers. They field the public phone calls that come in, and we were starting to get reports of explosions around the Northern Terminal switchyard, and we were also getting reports of a sea fog that had come in from the coast. And it turned out that this sea fog had come in and dropped on top of Northern Terminal, and the bus bars had flashed over, and a number of transmission lines had tripped. And basically we had voltage collapse from that, and cascading trips, generators. I don't remember how many generators were originally on at the time, but we ended up islanding with 2 small Muju units in the southwest, and they were radially feeding the 220 line out to Kalgoorlie and 266 lines down to Albany. and that's where that 108 megawatt stable load came from. So we went totally black, but the issue with that is you can't just bring that sort of generation up to the metro area and get a rebuild from it. It's too far away. You know, that's sort of 400 kilometers away. So it's not possible to even energize 330 kV lines with that sort of generation profile. So we had to think about a process to start black starting the metro area.
So in other words, while it wasn't a total blackout, but
Yeah.
the considerations that you had to apply was the same as total blackout, because
Yeah,
that sort of
it certainly was. It certainly was. You really were the stuff in the southwest. It wasn't. It was too far away with the transmission lines that we had to be able to bring it up quickly. We had, and the other side of it is we had black start capability on a number of GTs around the metro area, so we could start them reasonably quickly. So, you know, I think the first step was, and I'm just looking at some notes here, was look at the potential damage. You know, what can't we switch on? What are we restricted on? So that was good. The next thing we looked for was what resources we had. What resources we had around the control room, what resources we had in the field, and what we did with that is we created a second bulk transmission desk for the day. So the original bulk transmission controller took the metro area. We set up a second bulk transmission desk that looked after the North Country area. And then we aligned the two regional transmission controllers with each of those guys. So we had two separate groups that could go and we set some boundaries, and they could go and basically start black starting two systems by themselves.
Let me come back to how you black started the system.
Yeah.
But in terms of communication, you know, I guess you had to communicate with a lot of other parties. But what sort of communication was needed on that day?
Yeah. So there was a couple of things. As a lot of it was done within the control room itself, because we basically were able to energize substations. So we were able to put generation on, we were able to modify the network however we wanted, open and close breakers, and modify substation layouts so we could trip a lot of feeders and leave a local supply and a transformer to be energized when we energized the substation. Because we could do that all in-house, we just created these small teams that were able to do it. There still was a lot of field work that needed to be done. So we had the senior switching operator for the network. He came and based himself in the control room, and if we needed people at a substation, you know, maybe to hand wind some breakers, or because the spring charging on the breakers might have failed or something like that, we could get people there pretty quick. And they used various methods of communications, obviously no mobile phones in those days, but what we did have is we had the normal telephone system. Western Power had a PAC system, so it was a direct line into each substation, and then we also had two-way radios as well.
Yeah, I just mentioned that Western Power is the network owner and operator in Western Australia, and at the time of this blackout they were also the system operator.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, now let's focus on the actual bringing back the system, and I want to know how a system operator should go about restarting a large system like this. What are the sequences? What are the things that need to be considered?
Yeah, so you know, the things that need to be considered obviously are you're putting a generator on. It needs to stay within its working parameters, so it's going to be in an ISOC condition, so you need to stabilize the load around it within its min-gen, max-gen, within its ISOC capabilities. And then as you bring further generators on, obviously that unit is going to come back when the min-gen for the next unit comes on. So it's all about working out the parameters. And to give you an example of that, the black start unit we used out of Pinjar, it was a 35 megawatt unit. So you could load it to probably, and it had a min gen of 15 megawatts. So you'd have to load it up to about 30 before you could start the next unit. And you would have to have 3 of them on before you could start a frame 9. So the actual balancing of your generation was critical, obviously. And then to get that load, what's the best way to get that load? One of the biggest critical factors was in the zone substations, they use batteries for the protections and all these other bits and pieces. And I've got to say, in those days, the batteries were fairly old and not maintained well. And, so getting supplies back to substations to get these batteries operating was critical. Some of them actually failed within 2 hours. So the big thing was not to actually try and get the load back, but try and get supplies back to substations as quickly as possible. So energize as many substations as you could with minimum load, and then start building further load from there. So I think they're the two critical things, loading your generators and getting supplies back to substations.
Did you have procedures that you could just follow in this case, or you would just...
No. We didn't, and I've got to say that comes down, a lot of this came down to the experience of the operators. Both the 2 bulk transmission controllers we'd had originally already had 15 years experience in this type of job. They'd have been through multiple, under frequency load shedding type of events or storm events where we may lose 15 substations between sites. So they were very, very capable. The thought process of knowing what the critical things were, as I said, batteries and that type of thing, it just came natural to them. And what it was you simplify the process. Clear the bus bar in front of you, energize the substation with a transformer and a feeder, do it again. And one of the things that they were very proactive in, I think, was to check each other's work. Even although these guys were working in separate areas, when it came to critical decisions, they would always get the other one to check what they'd done beforehand. And an example of that was the Cannington bus bar. So the SCADA system we were using at the time was Harris 9400 system, and it had page-based displays. So, and you couldn't zoom or pan or any of those sort of things. You just put the display, you go. But the Cannington bus bar went over 3 displays. When the guy cleared the bus bar, he had another display up over here to look at generation profile, and he forgot about the 3rd display. And we were just about to energize Cannington bus bar, which we thought had been cleared. And if we'd done it, it actually had another 15 substations on it. We would actually have lost the whole system. And the bulk guy at the time asked the other guy to check before he actually energized the bus bar, and he noticed this other line still in service. So, work as a team. That's and these guys, I've got to say, the 3 of us had worked together for 30 years by this time. 20 years by that time. So we knew each other really well. There was no inhibitions about getting somebody else to check each other's work. And that really was, it was just a process they developed on the day. And it was take one step forward, don't take the next step until you've had your work checked. Make sure you know what you're doing. I think by doing that, they actually, there was two catalysts here that we could have actually blacked out the system during the restoration, and they caught both of them. Yeah.
Okay, I guess you're referring to things that can potentially go wrong during the process of re-energization. Did you have the experience of trying something and realizing that it doesn't work and going back to try something else?
With this, what we were trying to do is, as I said, Les, the controller, one of the bulk controllers, looked after the North Country. He brought the North Country down to the metro and then just held it, run it as an island. And we didn't want to synchronise the two systems because if we did have a black start, we were going to lose the whole lot. So we basically left that in its own little basket, and that was our backup then. We had metro generation that we could get. So if we didn't have black start units, at least we could bring that into a bus bar and start non-black start units. So that was one. The other one was we were bringing generation from Pinjar down through the metro area to Kwinana Power Station. And Kwinana Power Station had energised a small gas turbine to give auxiliaries to their generation plant. So we had to synchronise between the Pinjar units and the Kwinana unit, and we couldn't work out where the synchronising points were. We couldn't find any documentation. There was no procedure written around where these synchronising points were. So we ended up, it was too big a risk. So what we actually did was we de-energised a path back to Pinjar, brought Kwinana up to Pinjar because we knew there was a synchronising point at Pinjar. That wasted a bit of time, but the options were just too severe. You know, if we tried to close a line breaker that wasn't a synchronizing breaker, we could have lost a lot again.
Oh, great. No, I want to talk about, you know, the human elements. In this sort of situation, someone may naturally take lead in highlighting what needs to be done. What was it, like a collaborative effort, or somebody took the lead and establish what course of action need to be taken?
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened in this case. As I said, the guy that I was training on that day was had, you know, probably 25 years experience in the control room and really knew his stuff. He had a background in protection, he had a background in substation design and that type of thing. So he took the lead, but he was a very open guy. He wasn't one of these guys that just tells people what to do. So it's like, okay, I think we should do this. We're in agreement, and you know, everybody was just feeding their bits and pieces in. Because you know, I had worked in switchyards myself. The other guy that was a bulk transmission guy, he'd worked in protection for a fair bit. So it was just like everybody's putting their bits in. But you know, having a lead certainly helped us sort of get that initial momentum on what we were going to do. Yeah.
Thank you. The way you describe it to me seems that you had pockets that you energized, and then you synchronized those pockets at the synchronizing point that you were sure that it worked.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the steps and maybe the phases of re-energizing the system. So at some point, when you can get to system restoration, and then there is another point that you completely restart everywhere. Where is the point that you can say system has been brought back from black start? When you put the main generator on isochronous mode, what is the process?
Yeah, I think, you know, as I said, you're trying to get supplies back to as many substations as quickly as possible. So as you're doing that, your load is going up, obviously, but it's not a great load. So you are handling it, and if you get like a frame 9 onto isochronous, you've got a fair bandwidth of megawatts, so you can base load your other units, and so you can get quite a bit of load on the system before you start thinking, okay, I'll bring AGC back in and I'll get something to work on AGC. I think once you get AGC on, you would say the system is probably back to some sort of normality. Before that, it's a build process. And you know, do you get every substation back? We still had breaker problems at some substations. We couldn't close breakers because they weren't spring charged, and we couldn't get people there to wind the springs and get a closing capability on the substation. So there was still isolated little substations around the place that weren't on, but it took us about 5 hours to get 50% of the load back. So we were up to about the 700, 800 megawatts worth of load back on the system, and I think that's when we sort of thought that we're really back to some sort of normality. It took us about 3 hours to get the other 50% back.
That's great. Now I want to ask you about, what are those things that you need to do during this situation, and what are those things that you really need to avoid? So the do's and don'ts, if you can remember.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to stay cool. If you're going to start, running around the room shouting and screaming, you're not going to get there. So the first thing is you've got to stay cool and don't rush. You've got to have a plan. So don't write the things I put down here. Don't rush. Don't take risks. Understand the consequences of each action. And check. And always use people around you to check. So the don'ts are: don't rush, don't take risks, stay cool. The do's: know your system. And I can see this is where things are starting to get more difficult in today's world, because people focus on a smaller part of the system as things get bigger. But in those days, we knew the system, we knew the transmission layout, we knew the paths that we needed to build between transmission and generation sources. We knew about the batteries, we knew about what spring charging on breakers. We knew about inrush loading. So if we were going to energize something, where we were energizing a 330 line that would collapse the voltage, those types of things. Know your generators, know your min-max capacities, know which ones are better to put on ISOC and give you the best capacity for movement. You got to plan. You got to have a plan. If you don't have a plan, you will end up probably failing somewhere. You haven't thought of something down the track, so you'll have to backtrack. So initially sit down and build a plan and agree, if you're going to split it up into different systems, agree boundaries that people can work within. And the last thing is the do's: work collaboratively. Get people to check your work, you check their work, they check your work. I think all of that together gives you the best chance. There's always a chance that you've forgotten something, you've missed something, and you'll have to work with that when it happens. But those sort of things give you the best chance, I think.
Great. And I guess the power systems of today have changed a lot since around 30 years ago that this happened in Western Australia. Now we have a big share of distributed energy resources on at least this power system, and this can really complicate the matter. What is your advice for the controllers here or around the world if something were to happen on their shift that blacked out the system?
I suppose it depends on the design of their operational structure. Like in today's world, we've run, or AIM will run the market systems and the overall security on the network from a operational point of view. Within Western Power, they run two separate control rooms, one that looks after the transmission network and one that looks after the distribution network. So whereas in my day we did all of that in one room, now we've actually got that across 3 rooms. As well as that, as you said, we've got distributed PV. So in my day we never had any PV. And basically no wind either. So to control the loading on generators was quite simple. What will happen today is we will energize feeders or wherever, and we will get an initial inrush of load, and then local PV will come on, and it will take longer to stabilize. So I can see that there'll be other challenges for this in the future. How do you stabilize loads as you're rebuilding a system? I don't know the answer to those things, but there are certainly challenges out there.
So the power systems of today have more uncertainty in terms of intermittency of renewable generation.
Definitely.
Weather effects affect the power system, both load and generation.
Yeah.
But we may have a better control systems to run the power system.
Yeah, I think the obviously your SCADA systems are more accurate. You've got more functionality within them. The fundamentals are the same. You're still trying to balance load and generation. The facilities, the wind farms and the solar farms and things like that come through your SCADA system, yes, you've got control on it. The one that is the real out there is the rooftop solar. How can we control that better? How do you actually, do you have systems where you can get out to the public and ask them to switch it off? Do you actually monitor them in real time so that you've got Pi data or whatever that you can actually simulate what could happen as you energize? All of these things are things that people will have to think about in the future, I think.
Great. Gordon Kane, I know this is your last week at work before retirement after 48 years of working with this industry, very distinguished career. Thank you very much. In the end, is there anything you would like to add in terms of advice to people in this industry, especially on power system controllers?
From an operational perspective, it's a living thing. It changes every day, it changes every hour, and you've got to build the tools that you need to be able to sort of manage that. You need to be proactive in decision making. Building guidelines and those sort of things will help. As we get more technical with more SCADA systems, more control systems, it'll be about running them, optimizing them. So I think a lot of it is actually going away from just what you know and how you did things in the old ways. Now it's got to go to a procedure. We've got to build more procedures. They've got to be better maintained, and then you'll get a better outcome. I've enjoyed my time, I've got to say.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Tom, we appreciate
Thanks, Dean.
interviewing us.